This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning Substack podcast. And I'm here with my friend Aneil Mallavarapu, who I have worked for, actually, years ago, over 5, like pre-pandemic. So Aneil is a biotech investor, entrepreneur, scientist, and he has a blog, aneilbabu.substack.com, and we're going to talk about some of the stuff he's written there, and also like some of the work he's doing in the AI/consciousness field. He runs Humain Ventures, which I think you guys invest mostly in health related stuff, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so that's your current thing, and you're an advisor at Stanford Soul Foundation. You are Dr. Mallavarapu as well. You have a PhD, I think from UCSF, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, UCSF. It's kind of a big deal. I mean, UCSF's a big deal. Everyone in biology knows that, right? Let's just get into it. You gave a talk actually at a venue I run here in Austin. You live in Austin. We know each other socially, and it was about consciousness and AI. And you have a post on your Substack, which you have multiple posts, but the case against conscious AI, why AI consciousness is inconsistent with physics. And I want to be clear here because we've talked about this. Consciousness to you is different than intelligence.
That's right.
Yeah. So
totally right.
You can accept AI superintelligence or whatever, but the strong AI proponents usually assert that AI is conscious. And, as your Substack starts out, we talk about why that matters, because if something is conscious, then there's an argument whether that's a person. And, in terms of like whether it's a person with rights, So if this is a ridiculous way to start out, but let's say we had an AI and like we think it's conscious. If you pull the plug and it shuts down, did you just kill it? Stuff starts to get weird that way, right? But
so you have to pay. Do you have to pay your AI or be accused of slave labor?
Yeah, that's the thing. I was like, I pay some for for these LLMs, but yeah. So just really quickly, I guess before we get into it,
but is OpenAI paying them?
Yeah. Again, like we start to go into like the absurd, right? Or what feels like it's absurd. So, we're talking about this partly because, here in 2025, we're recording in 2025. This podcast is going to be hopefully up for a long time. The Substack will be around for a while. But, we are in the midstream of the LLM revolution. OpenAI, really kicked it off with ChatGPT about 3 years ago, but now Gemini, Claude, you got Grok, you have DeepSeek, you have all these players, and they're scrambling, to get data centers, to get compute, to scale up. I think, I don't know how they estimate this, but, I've heard like, okay, our LLMs currently, the best of them are around 120 IQ, which is, kind of like high midwit, it's smart, but, not a genius or anything like that. So that's where we are, but where are we going to be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Like people are starting to talk about Ray Kurzweil's prediction of superintelligence, of the singularity. I've had people on, Nate Sears, who's co-author of Eliezer Yudkowsky, a pretty alarmist book about artificial intelligence and how, it could destroy our civilization. We're not going to talk about that directly. We're going to talk about something that's, kind of weirder. And, that is consciousness. Weirder because, I've read books on consciousness, Aneil, and I still don't know what's going on, in terms of like, it's a really difficult topic to grapple with. I think you do a good job in your presentation and also in this post, in outlining what it means. But I guess, the way I would want to start out is, can you distinguish for the listener the difference between intelligence and consciousness?
Yeah, intelligence is really about the ability to do things and produce outputs. And consciousness is the ability to have feelings, to actually experience something, not detect something. So detection is different from experiencing something. And I think that, people who are on the other side of the debate about whether consciousness is real or we can define it like that will say, well, how would you know that something is conscious? They will ask about material tests for consciousness. And that's where things get, it gets puzzling because we don't have a direct test for measuring something with a device. Right. And that's what we usually accept as our proof that, some phenomena exist. But we also don't detect a lot of other things directly. We detect them indirectly through devices. We don't see photons directly. We don't image them. We have evidence for them. We don't see the quantum wave function. We have mathematics which describes it and describes its effects. And with consciousness is very, it's even one step more complicated than that because, for those of us who are conscious, and that might not include everybody, which also might contribute to the confusion on this topic. I think we should keep that in mind when certain people say they're not conscious. Certain philosophers will say that. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're not experiencing something. I have aphantasia, and so I can't imagine things in my mind's eye. So I'm missing a certain type of consciousness. When I go under anesthetics, I'm not conscious, and people sleepwalk, and they seem not to be conscious of what they're doing, but they're able to walk around and manipulate things in their environment. Maybe they just don't have a memory of it, but maybe they're actually not having conscious perception of what their body is doing and what their eyes are seeing. So that's all formally possible. But this still remains like, what is this stuff? I only have one example of it, and it's my own. It's some viewpoint with colors and smells and feelings that seems to originate from this thing that I call my body. It's projected, the viewpoint is from the perspective of my body. So I say that it's my consciousness and I'm experiencing something, but also epistemologically, for those of us who are conscious, uh, everything else is secondary to consciousness because I've never touched or seen an atom. I infer that there's an atom. The table in front of me is, something that I see. I presume it's there, but I don't directly experience the table. I experience things in my consciousness. I have feelings on my hands. I have something in my visual perspective that tells me that there's a table there. So in that sense, consciousness is more fundamental than everything else. And that shouldn't be a problem. That's a given that we all actually accept. And there's this puzzle that Descartes posed, which was his demon. And he said, well, suppose that there's a demon that's fooling me and creating this entire world that's around me. What would I actually know? And that's where he goes on to talk about, he says, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And he located it with thinking. And, back then, I don't think that we had distinguished thinking and perception and feeling and all of these terms that have become much more well-defined now. But Descartes recognized in a sense, and all of those early Enlightenment thinkers as well recognized that what they called the soul or spirit or perception was not explicable in the new framework that they were building. But now we've gotten so deep in that framework, we say, well, it doesn't fit in the framework. Well, we knew that at the beginning of the Enlightenment, but we all really, those of us who are conscious, that is our primary experience. And that's the only thing that we can know. If Descartes' demon is fooling with us, the only thing we know that the universe contains are colors and feelings, sensations, sounds. That's, in a sense, epistemologically, the most certain thing. And so that's what I mean by consciousness. There are two things that I'm talking about. One is the qualia, which are things like red, the smell of peppermint, and so on and so forth. And then consciousness is typically the thing which is perceiving the qualia. So that's another way of talking about consciousness, is that which perceives qualia. And so in that sense, it's well defined and we know what we're talking about, but it's not something that's directly measurable with an instrument. Unless, of course, we take other human beings, we grant that other human beings are conscious like we are, and then we can do experiments either with them or with ourselves and then see how consciousness changes. And we have done experiments like that. So in many ways, like apart from that central problem, you can get around it. And it's really a topic for scientific conversation. It should be. It's so primary. It's fundamental. And it's only ideology that has kept it, outside of science, or, also there are problems inside of it, which make it very difficult to, to make sense of within our framework of the brain and what we think the brain is. So I think that that's why there's this big problem. It's ideology.
Well, so let's first of all, I guess like the way I want to is like, I want to get to what you think the brain is or like how it works. But first let's talk about computer and how a computer works. And, one of your arguments is a computer is a classical machine, right? I mean, it's a machine, it's classical. And,
They're called
people,
computers, right?
yeah.
To distinguish them from
Well, so, I mean,
quantum.
So computing, a lot of cognitive science uses metaphors, uses terminology from computing with connectionism, with neural networks and all these things, and then, they cross-fertilize each other. And so a lot of people of our generation, age, background, we grew up kind of in the computing age, and this analogy, as opposed to, I think in the past, neuroscience used like analogies from like steam engines and stuff like that. People have noticed that changed, right? Talk about what you are defining as a computer, and how it works, and like what people say about there are people who just think it's a scaling problem. Like you put enough, you have enough memory, you have enough compute, and then you will get consciousness.
Yeah. Well, that definitely can't be the case. And the reason for, like, what is a computer? Well, Turing defined this notion of computing when he set out to answer Hilbert's Entscheidungs problem, which is the decision problem. And he invented this concept called the A machine, the automatic machine, and he showed how you can have a small set of operations, memory, and you can prove that the Entscheidungs problem can't be solved, and that which was basically Hilbert was asking, is there a decision procedure that can answer any question in mathematics? And he showed kind of a result that's similar in flavor to Gödel's theorem, that you cannot, and the system is incomplete. But, as a side product, he invented this notion of computing. He defined what a computer is. And then later, many different computer scientists over the years, they started demonstrating that many systems were equivalent to the Turing machine. And so you have this notion of Turing equivalence. So if you have a certain set of operations, memory and states in the machine, and the ability to read and write the memory and update the state, you get something that's computationally equivalent. That is, so something that's made of wood and, gears can do all of the same computes and is mathematically equivalent to our fastest supercomputers, and could, in principle, with enough turns of the crank, do what ChatGPT or any future AI is doing on those machines. And so that's a solid mathematical, it's a proof and foundation of computer science. And so I think about computers as Turing machines, those classical computers as Turing machines. And that's really what I'm talking about. And that's what everybody is talking about with respect to AI. They're saying that Turing machines are conscious. And, like what I point out is, there's this guy, Alonzo Church, who wrote this thing called the lambda calculus, which gave rise to Lisp. The idea of lambda calculus was used to develop ideas in Lisp, the programming language. And what Alonzo Church was doing was basically writing a calculus that was very, very minimal, where he wanted to build up all of mathematics out of this tiny set of primitives of these rewriting operations. And what Alonzo and Church Church and Turing showed was that his pen and paper system was also Turing equivalent. And so if you're saying that computers are conscious, you're also saying that using a pen and paper would be conscious. So if I just write out the lambda calculus, which would be a huge, like so many stacks of paper to do, one token prediction in ChatGPT, the idea is, and I think that this is what the philosophers of consciousness say, is that as long as these informational flows are present in whatever system, then a pen and paper system would be conscious. And, I wonder things like, well, when does it become conscious? Does it become conscious when I write the last letter in the computation? Is it when my pen hits the paper? Is it when it's partway through writing the digit? Is it when it comes off the paper? What exactly is the boundary for what counts as a compute? And who decides that? It's just, there are all of these problems where it doesn't really make sense. Or you could take a machine, like let's say you had a machine made of gears. You can make it out of water valves or, all kinds of things. But let's say you had one made of gears, like the same physics that's going on in your lawnmower. And they say, well, there's hierarchical information processing, or they'll say that maybe there's a feedback loop in the states of the system. Well, if I just disassemble the computer, or I make a new one and I put it together in random order at the last step of the computation, and I turn the crank once, is that conscious? Like, does it depend on the hit? Like the machine only depends on the current state of the system. It doesn't depend on all of the things that happened before. You can see that because all I have to do is turn the crank. I can assemble it in that state and turn the crank. So how does consciousness depend on all of this past history? It doesn't make sense. So that's kind of what I started thinking about. And that's like why I think you can see in examples like that, if you're honest, like there's something really wrong with this picture of saying that these kinds of machines, which in principle compute a single bit at a time, and there are 12,000 floating point numbers in a single token of ChatGPT. And multiply that by 16. That's like a lot. That's a huge number of bits just for one token of an output. And each of them could be computed one at a time by a machine pushing wooden dowels back and forth. I mean, when you think about that, it just strains credulity. And I think that there are a lot of people who make arguments like that, but there are these arguments of incredulity. They're not really proofs, because people can say somehow the system itself, in aggregate is because of all of those operations. And, there's a lot of hand waving and promissory physics, and there are new psychophysical laws that are going to explain that. And that's really what I'm talking about, is that we can prove that kind of idea is just flagrantly in violation of physics.
I mean, so, just listening to you, I mean, could it be like, let's imagine, let's say we have a computer the size of the galaxy. Do you think that computer could simulate consciousness from the external perspective? Like, it would seem like, can we tell the difference? Like, like Arthur C. Clarke had that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Could we reach a point where any sufficiently advanced computing is indistinguishable from consciousness from our perspective externally?
Well, externally, I mean, arguably, ChatGPT has already convinced many people that it is. So we don't need a universe-sized computer to solve that problem. We already know the answer. We're easy to fool.
Yeah.
But that doesn't answer whether it's true. That just answers whether people are easily fooled. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, arguably, like, isn't it true that Turing test has pretty much been passed many, many times a long time ago?
It has, and like this is another one of my pet peeves. Like people actually read Turing's paper because he does not say it's a test for consciousness. I don't know who came up with that, but what he says, it's not even a test for intelligence, and he says that right at the beginning of the paper. I think it's called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, and the starting part. He makes fun of the question of whether computers can be intelligent. He says, the answer to that question is best answer, or the definition and answer to the question are best answered by consulting a Gallup poll. And so he says, there's no point in even asking the question. It's so poorly defined. So he says, instead of that, I'm just going to pose a game that we can play. And this we can answer. Will people be fooled into thinking it's a person? So it's just entirely like a technical engineering problem. It's a product question. He's asking, can we build this product which will fool people into thinking it's a person on the other end of the line? And that's what the imitation game is. And it's very specifically not a test of consciousness, but in popular culture, people say that is the test of consciousness, but it's not. And it's not, this is what happens when we have computer scientists and philosophers talking about a topic that is really one about biology and physics, because this is the question for biologists, in my view.
Yeah. So going to biology, talk about your perception, not perception, like there's all these ideas of consciousness and what it is, but you mentioned the Penrose idea and the relationship to quantum versus classical. Talk about quantum versus classical and how that applies to consciousness in the brain.
Well, I mean, I think that that's a leap, right? And I don't, Roger Penrose made an argument and I think that this is probably the central maybe argument for philosophical argument for quantum consciousness. I don't know if I've heard other rigorous arguments like Rogers for it. I have another one. But what he says is that Gödel's theorem shows that any formal system has statements in it which we can know to be true, but cannot be proven by the system. And so therefore, our consciousness must not be a formal system. And that has not seemed to, like, just practically, that hasn't seemed to convince people. He might be right in some way, but I don't know. My mind always goes to places where I can reject that with other kinds of views, like, well, maybe we are a formal system with more rules. There are some other objections to that argument as well. And so then, people said, do things like, well, consciousness is weird and you can't solve the binding problem with classical mechanics. And therefore we should look into quantum systems. And none of those are super convincing arguments for quantum consciousness. But I think that there is a convincing, there's an argument where we have to look in quantum systems because you can prove that we cannot find it in classical systems. And the kind of thing that we need seems to be satisfied by certain quantum systems. And that's kind of the way I look at it. Like, mainly, I'm making a negative argument that we can know analytically that classical systems where you have parts that are discrete, they have known state, and they only interact with things locally, cannot capture enough information to account for what we have in our consciousness. And I can go through that. That requires a little bit to unpack, but that's sort of the high level structure of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, as I was reading your Substack post, which will be linked in the show notes, it just struck me, obviously, not obviously, but okay, so classical physics can't account for this. Okay, well, I mean, unless you believe in magic, unless you want to make supernatural appeal, it's got to be. I already knew it was going to be. You know what I'm saying? I knew you were going to say something about quantum physics because that's the only way that I could see that this could work. Does that make sense? I mean, I don't know. I mean, yeah. I mean, yeah. So I mean, maybe you could want to go deeper into that. I don't know. How much. I mean, it's this is kind of something that's easier to write about in a structured way than I guess talk about. But can you just can you just explain to people why quantum computing, people have been trying to, and you mentioned Scott Aronson in your post. Scott Aronson's a quantum computing guy here, here at University of Texas Austin. I know him, I think you know him too. And
I've met
there's
Scott.
you what?
I hope to, maybe at the next.
Well, yeah, he'll be speaking. Okay, this is a little break the third wall, but he'll be speaking on the 5th, actually at the venue. So if you want to swing by, he'll be doing an AMA. But yeah, I guess talk about why quantum computing is even a thing, as opposed to classical computing. And I think we know cryptography. There's these practical applications people talk about, but talk about a more abstract way, and then maybe loop it back to I don't know, some of Penrose's ideas, about consciousness. Because I mean, they've been out there for a while, but I don't know if people know them.
Well, yeah, Penrose got together with this anesthesiologist named Stuart Hammerhoff. And Stuart, and I think some other people, but Stuart runs it now, started this Science Towards the Science of Consciousness conference, which is almost like the start of this period where we've started to talk about consciousness as a scientific phenomenon. And that was 30 years ago. I was at the second one of that. And, I think Roger presented. I know David Chalmers and Ned Block and Daniel Dennett and, just everybody under the sun, every major philosopher and thinker and consciousness was there. And, the philosophical theories, I don't know what to do with. I think more in terms of scientifically, what is the connection between the brain and our conscious experiences? And that's kind of the central scientific problem, that we do have something which I think many, but not all people accept represents a unification of information in a single space. And the way I would, this is a bit long before I get to the answer, but let me just set it up, because this is a really central point, and it's the central puzzle of consciousness, which is how to account for the unity of consciousness. And what is that? When you look at your, out in the world, you see stuff, and you don't just see, a dot of color. You see all of these colors arranged in a, say, two-dimensional field, and they're next to each other. So in that sense, red is bound to a spatial location. It has an intensity. So there's hue, intensity, and position in your visual field, and those things are all bound to each other. But we know that information is distributed in the brain. So there are different neurons doing different parts of the compute. And if you think about it at the level of the particles, a neuron, what is a neuron but a set of electrons and atoms? And all of these things have very limited state. Like the electron has position, momentum, and charge, right? And its location. So how do you account for all of that information when you have all of these separate parts? And this was actually something that Leibniz talked about. He was the guy who invented calculus alongside Newton, and was the first person to conceive of a thinking and perceiving machine. And there's this famous argument called the mill argument, where he said, well, imagine a machine like a mill that could do all of these calculations and, compute. And if I walked inside of it, I would only see the parts pushing against one another and nothing to account for perception. And that's what led to his philosophy of monads. but we still never had a satisfying explanation for, well, how does all the information which is distributed end up unified in our conscious experience? And that's the central problem. And the way that I think about that is the answer needs to be in the form of an equation. And what we have are a lot of philosophy essays and metaphors and analogies and people saying, I just think that. And whenever you hear that, your alarm bells should go off, because that's just some intuition that's very vague and hand wavy. And what we need to do is really think about it from the perspective of there's physics in the brain. Physics governs the matter of the brain. We know that the brain mediates consciousness. And then consciousness is a time variant property. Like your consciousness is changing all the time, just as you look around the world and time goes on. And you can think of that as a data structure containing information. And that needs to be bound to something. It's determined by something physical. I believe that. So the question is, what does the structure of that look like? So you could say C of t, C is a function of time, it is equal to F, which is some mapping function of a physical state of a system. And that's what any theory of consciousness really is trying to propose. What does F look like and what are the arguments to F? And then you can think about it very rigorously once you start adopting that framework, instead of using nonsense phrases like, the mind is software running on the hardware of the brain, and saying, well, consciousness is symbolic, so therefore, it's created by symbolic processes. These are just philosophical words and phrases that don't really mean anything, and it doesn't answer any scientific problem. You just imagine if we wrote philosophy essays when we looked at the two-slit experiment instead of writing math. It would be a shit show right now. And that's where consciousness studies is. Because of that, we're writing philosophy essays instead of doing science. So my point about that, Razib, is once you start thinking in those terms, what are the arguments to F? The brain at the current moment in time. But what so many other theories of consciousness, other than the quantum ones, are saying is that it depends on the past history of the brain. That is, they talk about information flows. Well, what does that mean? You're saying brain at time t, brain at time t minus 1 and t minus 2, or t minus, some arbitrary time steps, which are just chosen kind of ad hoc because that helps them get their theory of consciousness off the ground. Where do those time steps come from? What are the objects? How does physics recognize the objects? It's just a big mess of conjecture and lack of definition. And so once you really start to define it, you'll realize, well, if you write a function like that, a function where you have something that's depending on multiple time steps formally violates time symmetry, and it implies time non-locality and spatial non-locality in terms of the information that's in all of those places. So 5 milliseconds ago, some neuron was doing something. Okay, well, but I'm having this experience now. So how does the information from that neuron 10 milliseconds ago, or from, let's say, a light signal from a computer the size of the galaxy that's sending signals around, how does that impact my current conscious experience? You would need to have something that has universal access to all events in the universe, which would violate spatial locality and time locality for classical objects. There's no such concept at all in physics. And then the theory violates time symmetry because you actually have to choose the time step. And then, in fact, if you just choose an arbitrary time step, you don't know if previous events, would then qualify for some structure, like some feedback loop, say, to actually exist in your current time step. So you have to actually analyze the history of all events in the universe to make sense of these theories. And the only place that we do that is in these weird theories of consciousness. So that's why I feel like, I think that you can see just as soon as you try to write the equations, that this stuff does not resemble physics and violates most of our central ideas about physical objects. And yet they're claiming that physical objects produce this.
Yeah.
And so that just doesn't make sense. You cannot account for, we need a theory because we know that the brain is causing this view to be created, right? Or it's mediating it. Let me put it that way. And so, well, how do we account for that? And I think that the simplest move is to say that this time variant property is a function of the state of the matter of the brain at the current time. So then that's what forces you to accept non-locality.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm not sure if that landed, but
I get it. I mean, okay, here's what I would say. And I think like some of the listeners will sympathize. Richard Feynman said, nobody really understands quantum physics, which is like a little bit of a flip. I mean, like you can do the equations, and I've taken quantum chemistry courses, and I've done the equations and stuff like that. It's just that classical physics, and this is why Einstein liked it, is just so easy for us to comprehend on an intuitive level. And so it's kind of I'm gonna swear, it's kind of like a mind fuck if we are the product of quantum physics and we can't even understand it,
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like that's how I'm feeling a lot of the time.
And I think that that's why it's so hard for, people don't want to deal with that weirdness. Right now, it's sort of confined to the very small and experiments in physics labs. And, but there are also really good technical reasons for rejecting it. And like Max Tegmark wrote this essay about, sort of analyzing what it would take to scale quantum phenomenon or have an entangled system. And he pointed out that it would, these systems would decay instantaneously far faster than, an axon potential. And so there's no way to scale them up. But, all of this stuff has to be, I think, treated very carefully because he was just analyzing a water bath. And biology is not a water bath. There are all kinds of structures and highly structured structures inside of cells.
Yeah.
And that's where, Penrose and Hameroff started talking about microtubules. Stewart had some evidence that, all of the anesthetics actually affected these structures, which I actually worked on, as it turns out, in my graduate work, that we were totally from the materialist side of it. And, my professor doesn't even believe consciousness is real. Like we were just biochemists of microtubules. And these are long structures. They sort of make up the axons. They're the structural elements inside the axons, as you know. And there's been recent work about these tryptophan residues that form a network that I think that there's good evidence, I will say, from the lab of Philip Korean that shows that these are in some sort of entangled state. And I think the speculation is it's a Dickey state, which is basically this system with a bunch of two-state systems that can be in two states. So the electron can be, I think, in one configuration or another, and each of these tryptophans and those states can be shared along the network. And then they did some experiments with, taking a look at hyperradiance as they illuminated them, and the model showed that this is this indicates quantum biology, and we know that there's lots of quantum effects in biology, like photosynthesis depends on quantum effects, but they're very small. That's just a little jump. And so here is whether you can scale it. And so now we have this viewpoint where maybe there's some evidence that it's where you have a scale entangled state in microtubules, but we still have no idea how would that expand to other microtubules, because it's not just one microtubule that makes you conscious. It's the connection, it's the integration of the information between all of them.
Well, so I guess as you're talking about microtubules and all this abstruse stuff, when I was reading your post, I thought about something. Uh, so consciousness and intelligence are separate. I know a pig is not as intelligent as a human, but I just realized, I mean, maybe a pig is conscious, in which case, like, I mean, this is like not related to what I was really gonna like talk to you about before I read some of the stuff that you sent, and I just started thinking maybe consciousness is really common, and maybe we need to like reflect a little bit about the way we do various things, like factory farm. I don't know. Have you thought about that? Because it's like, because like for me, like, before I started talking to you, I think I just conflated intelligence and consciousness a lot, and that makes things easy because we know shrimp don't. For example, shrimp are not intelligent. Just to use an example, a less like explosive example than pigs. But I just do wonder now, like if you decouple intelligence and consciousness from somewhat, then maybe consciousness is much older. Like the intelligence to be able to do formal mathematics is definitely like limited to our lineage. Like I don't think even whales can do that. But what if consciousness is much more basal, is much more like deep in our evolutionary? I mean, what are the what are the implications for that? I don't know. I'm just like, have you thought about that?
I have, like, I mean, it's obviously an important question because, just on the operating table, there's a question of whether, or, somebody in a vegetative state, are they conscious? Are they brain dead? We don't really have good measures for that. And there's there's this one theory of consciousness called IIT, integrated information theory, where they're proposing that their model is a way of measuring consciousness, and then they can get it from EEG readings. And they're proposing a device that actually tells you whether somebody is conscious or not. And it has real applications, but also has applications in all of these other areas, as well as, really hot button topics, in society, like abortion and, the suffering of animals, for sure. And the way I would look at it is, this is a natural phenomenon, right? It's not a computational, like that would be an assumption to say it is a computational phenomenon. What we know, like I have one example of it, I have my one example of consciousness. And I grant that other things may be conscious, right? And I grant that you may be conscious, Razib, because you're structurally, operationally, and compositionally similar to me. You have a brain, it has the same biology, it's running on doing whatever it's doing, is doing something very, 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 very similar to me. So I have a good reason to grant that you're probably conscious. You talk about consciousness. With animals, they can't talk, but they do have brains. And it doesn't mean that, some people like Aneil Mallavarapu will say, I think only living things can be conscious. I don't believe that. I think that this is a question for physics because, if we were to say only living things are conscious, then we'd have to believe that there's some vital force that distinguishes biological systems from the rest of matter. And we don't believe in vitalism anymore. So there's no principled reason to say that only biological things are conscious. But the question is, what is the physics and where should we study it? And the only place that we can study it is in the right model system. Like, the example I like to give is, we can study cell division, right? And people will take cells out of, some organism and grow them up in a petri dish and then put them on a slide. And they will argue to their fellow scientists, this is a good model for cell division. I'm going to study it. And people will debate that. No, it's not, because, you're altering a bunch of things and it's sticking to the glass, and that's messing up what's actually happening. And they have a very high standard for determining whether you're looking at the relevant phenomena that you're saying that you're looking at. But what computer scientists are doing is saying, oh, well, consciousness is computation because it feels like it. And that would be equivalent to me going out into the yard and picking up a rock and saying, hey, look, this is round just like cells. And now I'm going to study cell division by studying this rock. I mean, it's not a good model system. Nobody does science like that. And there's just such terrible scientific standards in this field where this stuff is accepted. Or then people will say, oh, only biological things can be conscious. That has nothing to do with anything. This is a question of the right model system. And then how do we answer the physics challenge that is posed by this natural phenomenon? And we have to study it initially in humans, and I could study it maybe in another human being, but equivalently, if we have, the right technologies to alter the physics that we're hypothesizing is going on in the brain, then I could do it on myself. And then I could report as a first person and say, aha, yes, the color spectrum has changed, or my visual field has changed in this space. I no longer see anything in this part of my visual field because we've wiped out whatever the physical phenomena is that correlates with it. That's good science. Saying that the mind is software that runs on the hardware of the brain and it's symbolic is philosophical bullshit. And so that's
No.
people need to do in this space is it needs, like, we have 350 different theories of consciousness now, 350 plus. And when I first wrote the paper, it was 225. Now there are 350. It's madness. Like, imagine if we had 350 different theories for what life is.
Yeah. No, I feel you. Yeah, I feel you. I mean, it's, I think Ludwig Wittgenstein said sometimes you can't say certain things, so you have to whistle it, which is kind of a bullshit thing to say. But the point is, philosophy has been going in circles for thousands of years around this topic. So, I can hear the frustration in your voice, but I think a lot of us share it because it's an important question. And I've had Eric Hoel, neuroscientist, on, talking about, for like a generation, neuroscientists looked away from consciousness because it was just too stressful. They couldn't tackle it, and now they're kind of coming back to it because it's such, the hard problem, which you allude to, in your post. I mean, I think, there, yeah.
I have started thinking there's not a hard problem, actually. It's a hard problem because of the models. It's a hard problem for certain models of consciousness. And it's a hard problem when you think about it as processes. And that comes from cognitive science and neuroscience, where they're like charting out how the computation happens in the brain. And that is a sequence of processes. This neuron, activates the next neuron and activates the next neuron. That's a process in time. And once you look at the problem like that, then you have a very hard problem, which is inconsistent with physics. That's why it's a hard problem, because you have to violate time locality and space locality and time symmetry. And that's why it's been a hard problem, because they're bad models. They're just totally invalid and inconsistent with physics, these models. That's why people have been struggling and thinking it's a hard problem. But if you adopt this view, and then now there's some emerging evidence that maybe this is right, is that if it's a state of a quantum system, then you have a system at a single time that has information that is indivisible in the structure of the density matrix. You actually have correlations between different parts of a system that can be distributed spatially. And so that's what I think, that's why, quantum phenomena like entanglement, that's the only one that I can think of. I don't think superposition counts for various other reasons, but I think, and it's super hard because of the warm-wet problem and crossing the boundaries, but it's not theoretically impossible. It's just technically hard. Whereas, all of the theories like GWT or IIT or computationalism on the extreme end, they're flagrantly in violation of basic physics, and nobody addresses that. It's all dressed up with philosophy and analogy and hand waving. And I'm like, no. We know that it's matter in the brain at a specific moment in time that must be correlated with your current conscious state. And so now we can look in physics where we know because there's a Nobel Prize that has, told us that, in fact, at the very most basic layer, matter is not local. And there can be, under very carefully controlled systems, you have these joint probability distributions, and you have correlations between things that are distant from each other. And that has the kind of the flavor of what you need to start building rigorous mathematical, scientific, and testable theories of consciousness. So I don't think it's a hard problem then, if you look at it through that lens. It's a hard theoretical problem, but it's not a hard problem like it just doesn't fit with our science. No, it could fit with our science. We just have to look in the right place. So that's why I think quantum theories of consciousness are really the only viable theory of consciousness that we could propose. And that's the way I don't say consciousness is definitely quantum, but it is definitely, like, I don't know whether quantum theory, well, what we have is going to answer it, but it does have to be non-local.
Yeah. Yeah, the non-locality seems key in terms of like just what we perceive, the qualia, this sort of stuff. So yeah, I definitely invite people to check out your Substack post and the others. I want to like with the time we have left, we've been, I I could talk about whether the sun is conscious. There was a lot of thoughts triggered actually by like this the way you've articulated this, I have to say, and I think people will find that. But let me ask you about biotech, healthcare, and just like biological science spaces in the United States right now. Like what is your take about? We're at it. We're right now. I think we're kind of in like a correction when it comes to biotech investing and stuff like that. There's a lot of economy's not looking the best, to be honest. Like basically, it's AI and everything else. And so, what do you see as a guy in biotechnology, healthcare, in the life sciences space right now? You've been in this like area for a while now, so you have some, long-term personal data to draw.
Well, I don't think I'm alone in seeing the huge opportunity for AI in the life sciences. And I started thinking about this right before ChatGPT hit. I knew something was going on. AI had always been super boring because it was another tool in the machine learning or stats toolkit the biologists use, from my perspective. So you'd have things like support vector machines or AI, like deep learning, which didn't really work well anyway. So you just go use support vector machines to, separate your data and do classification. And I knew that there was something new that was happening. It was right before ChatGPT 3 came out. And I started reading the Attention is All You Need paper and looking at what all the techniques were and all the mathematical techniques. And that's when I realized, oh, wow, they've solved this problem called the vanishing gradient problem. They had solved it some time ago. I just wasn't paying attention. And this now allows us to do deep learning. That's why you can have these much, much deeper networks, and you can pass the error through all of those networks and update the weights, which turns out to have been just a dirty hack, that's not a good function for calculus, because it's it's not a continuous function. It's what's called a rectified linear unit, and which is just an if-then statement. And that, when I saw that and I saw all of the other techniques, I realized, wow, we're actually in a new regime now. And we are not just going to be able to learn from text. We're going to be able to learn from all kinds of complex data. And there's no more complex data than we have in biology. And in fact, language is biological data. And we can see how much we can get from generative AI applied to those data sets. And that was why we started this fund, Lene and I. And it was really predicated on this idea that now we're going to move into another phase of biology where it's not just a science that we study. It's not a place where we just discover new facts about biology, but where we're going to start engineering it. And, we've been engineering it like by tinkering in little ways of like gluing proteins together. But now we will be able to generate entirely new functions and do things that we've never been able to do before. And that is, in fact, what has started happening. And I'm not the only one who's called this out. Like Eric Schmidt talked about how biology is ready for its ChatGPT moment, and Jensen Huang has talked about AI's greatest application is in the sciences. And so I think that's going to be the case. Like that is going to be one of the great applications of AI. And those companies they're not in the limelight like consumer AI is. But we're going to start seeing that percolating out into things like kind of under the radar of what most people appreciate, where what'll happen is as we become better at making drugs, we're going to solve problems like this 90 to 95% failure rate in clinical trials. Why is that? Why do we fail 90 to 95%? Well, biology is complicated. That's true. And you can't just throw AI on it. But it's also because we're making products that aren't specific enough. We make small molecules. Why do we call them small molecules? Because that's what chemists can design. They have rules where you don't try to design something very big. It's called Lipinski's Rule of Five. And the reason for that is once they get big, they either become insoluble, so they just end up as a pellet in your gut, or they're soluble, but then they can't cross your gut barrier. And so they can't get in and do whatever it is to your biology. But there are other molecules that do that. There are a lot of natural compounds that do that. And so there are companies that are designing that. And the only way that they're able to do that is with AI. And they're very productive with that. So that's like a small bore thing. There are other people who are like designing systems for evolving or differentiating cells so that there will be stem cell therapies where we take the pluripotent stem cells and then differentiate them into the kind of cell that you need to treat Parkinson's patients by just replacing them. And so there's a whole slew of therapies that are going to be inside of that. And that's probably not something that's going to hit the public's radar because they won't interface with it directly. But that is going to start becoming a bigger and bigger trend, and those companies are going to do very well over time. And it's going to revolutionize the industry. So that's going to be huge. And, all of the other things, like ultimately, what are we doing when we're engineering biology? We're doing wet nanotech. And we are just starting to get purchase on that. And so that seems like a huge, exciting opportunity. And that's not going to go away. That's just something that has to be done. And it will be done. And people are doing it. And AI is going to bring the costs down in that sector as well. And not because it's replacing labor. It's because it's doing things that we have never been able to do before. So it's like fundamentally different in kind that way. So I don't know.
It seems like you're definitely long on the space, which makes sense, right? I mean, that's why you're investing in it. That's why you're devoting a lot of your life to it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There.
Let me just say something real quick because I think I've said this before. People have said, oh, when are we going to cure cancer? When are we going to do this? When are we going to do that? I do feel sometimes that I don't know why. Maybe because unlike Dragon or these like space vessel, like what SpaceX is doing, what Blue Origin did a decade after SpaceX already did it. But whatever. It's just so visible and charismatic. Whereas, so for example, there's apparently now a treatment as of 3 years ago that pretty much cures 75% of cystic fibrosis. 10 years ago, if you had told me that, if we had talked about when we met, that wasn't a thing. When we met, most people with cystic fibrosis are going to die between 40 and 60, 60 being very, very, very optimistic. But, they could probably last till 40 now, 40 something, Now they're almost like regular life expectancy. They could kind of live a functional life. And yet there was like an article in the Atlantic about it, but it's not something for some reason, it's not something that we talk about all the time. But when we
It's
were
not,
growing up,
it's not visible at the
yeah,
scale of
yeah,
regular people, right? Like at the end of the day, there's some vial in your doctor's office or there's some prescription on the shelf. And that's no different from anything that's been happening in your life for years. It's just another product that seems to be in the same category. And it's really the enabling technology that's making those things better. And then there's just an expectation that, oh, there's a new therapy. And people aren't aware of why those new therapies are appearing on the market. Like we've had this, one thing that has been different because the modality with which people use it is by injection is antibodies. And that was a revolution from 15 years ago where we started using what the body produces to address diseases by, binding the target protein. And, so people see that, but at the end of the day, it's just something that my doctor prescribed. So they don't understand where it's coming from. But, there will be other places where, it's hard to see. It's hard to see very far into the future. But there are things like that may hit the public consciousness. Like once we do more stuff in space and we have permanent state commercial stations in space, which is very much in frame now. There's the question of how you generate materials up in space. Plastics are a fantastic material because you can mold it into all kinds of shapes. The problem with plastics is they come from fossil fuels. And that would mean either carting the plastics up or bringing fossil fuels up. Well, we can make plastics. Like that's biology that makes long chain hydrocarbons. And, there are people who are working on making algae and other critters that can grow in space that will produce the starting materials for plastics. So you could have, and that in fact is where we will need to go for space exploration. Biology is going to be a massive part of that. It has to be, because we can't terraform entire planets, but we can get organisms that are going to do the things that we need them to do in those environments. And that's going to be absolutely critical. So there's stuff like that. And then there are charismatic projects like Colossal. And as you know, Linnea's, my partner is an advisor to Colossal. And they're, when we bring back the woolly mammoth, like the dire wolf sort of brought back. And, there's some talk about bringing the Tasmanian tiger back. Hopefully that'll happen sometime soon. People are taking notice that our capabilities in biology are increasing. Like how can we do that?
Okay. I have in terms of like when people will notice, here's what I think people will notice. When you can use stem cells to grow your own heart and get a heart transplant with a heart that is actually a younger version of your heart.
That's when you'll notice.
When that happens, people will be like, damn, I think it's good. Because then a lot of their older relatives will start getting that. It will be like part of their life, and they'll be like, whoa, this is like not just like a medication. It's like you're getting a new heart. And it's, I don't know. I feel like, and this is like a little bit woo woo because people, people are like, oh, like have a heart, like heart is where the love is. Even though we know intellectually that it's all in the brain now, people still like put a very, very big emphasis on the heart as an organ. And so I think, for example, when people, let's say you did that with the liver, which actually you might do it with the liver first.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really big deal, but I don't think it's going to have the same impact culturally. Because like livers are, you know what I'm saying? Like people associate liver with a gross thing that they had to eat, The heart, though, has we're talking about metaphors and all these things. The heart, I just remember when I saw Dragonland. This was 2017. It was before I met you. I knew Linnea, but somewhat. I remember when I first I thought I was watching science fiction. Like today we would call it, AI generated video, but I remember when I saw, that, spaceship, because the spaceship, we saw it land in that way. I was like, that cannot be real. Like that looks like really good science fiction, CGI. That just looks I wasn't ready to process it. Right. And I think that it's going to be that sort of situation, where
or germline engineering is going to be like, people are already proposing that. There are companies
Yeah.
where they're selecting embryos based on the genetics.
Yeah.
I'm count me skeptical. You get maybe 3 embryos, and then the variability between them that you can actually detect is going to be pretty limited unless there's, some very specific variant. And most of these things where people are selecting for intelligence, they're highly distributed, as you know.
Yeah.
And so your ability to do anything real there is questionable. But, I think there's going to be a place where people will start editing out debilitating disease.
Sure.
And then, once there's confidence in that technology, you can bet that people are going to start thinking about how do we engineer new functions? They will want that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's extremely culturally challenging, obviously.
Well,
that's exactly what's going to.
I think we're doing a little bit of that. We're doing a little bit of that in terms of the CRISPR gene editing with malaria, with sickle cell and stuff like that. There's already
it's already
we're obviously going to target the big Mendelian diseases first. I think so. I mean, in terms of biology being transformative, I think, me and you, hopefully, knock on wood, we'll live many more decades. We might see, I think, close to the abolition of a lot of congenital Mendelian diseases, either through screening or gene editing, right?
Yeah, that's right. And then the Jatis can continue on. Right?
Well, I mean, not the Jatis, but I think you probably know this, but I mean, there's a reason Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Dubai, UAE, they're really investing in this genetic screening technology because they can't get their people to stop marrying their cousins. And so
listen, the question is, are they really your cousin if you're not going to produce progeny with an inherited disease?
Okay, that shows you. It's basically, it's are you really into cousin marriage, or are you just a fair weather cousin marrier?
Right. Exactly.
I'm ready to have 4 or 5 retarded children with you. You know what I'm saying? That's how much I love you, cousin. Okay, this is. I'm glad this is the end of the podcast because it's where are we going with this? But no, I'm still. I'm not directly in the biological space right now in terms of my day job, but I still kind of observe it. I'm very excited. I'm excited to talk to people like you that are still involved in it, either as investors or entrepreneurs. I think it's transformative, and there's so much we could go on about. Cancer, for example, we haven't won the war on cancer, but look, if you look at cancer survival rates, stuff like pancreatic cancer, it's transformed in the last 20 years.
100%.
It's like 1,000 little battles is how we're winning the war. It's not some big, battle. It's just which makes sense because cancer is heterogeneous in terms of its origin and its presentation and everything like that, right?
Yeah.
Cancer is just something we clump into one thing.
Yeah, and then the other place that I think people are going to see it much more directly is in direct to consumer digital health. And then my view is we actually need a new type of company in the digital health space that's going to be highly AI enabled, which will replace the primary care doctor and preventive care, and it'll do preventive care. And we actually need a new type of financial system for that, or an insurance system that is all about long-term preventive health. And once we do that, I think that there's an opportunity for having this kind of parallel healthcare system, which is what people dream about, and they know it's the right thing, but all the incentives right now don't support it. So right now you have out-of-pocket payment for consumer health things like Function Health, which is blowing up. It sort of shows that consumers really have a demand for much, modern healthcare, and we're stuck in the 1800s with our model. You have to schedule a time with a doctor. The doctor is 14 years out of date. They just do what they do. You have to go and talk to many doctors to figure out what the right treatment is if you have something that's slightly complicated. And this is stuff that AI already has proven to do much better. And so once we start replacing the healthcare experience with an AI-driven experience, that's another place that it's going to hit. And it's not at the low level, playing with the atoms of a drug molecule level. It's much more dealing with, time variant complex human health and physiology. And then we're also going to have measurement tools that are going to be monitoring our bodies all the time. And then people, I think, are going to start really understanding the impact of AI in healthcare, because it's going to be very direct, and they're going to be interacting with an AI which determines their supplement stack and and nudges them into doing exactly the right things. And we'll have a financial model that supports that as well, so that people are going to be highly motivated to figure out their health, and we'll incentivize massive changes in the economy with that. But that's a whole other
Yeah.
set of thoughts.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was, great catching up with you and, exposing, my audience to some of your ideas. I think I think it's a lot to think about. Again, like this is gonna sound stupid, but the differentiation between consciousness and intelligence was kind of like, oh, it wasn't, it was like, it was obvious after the fact, like after, but before I had like not thought about it. And I think that's what people really need to think about, in terms of like when we talk about super intelligence. Does super intelligence have rights? Well, I mean, maybe that's the wrong question to ask about intelligence. I don't know.
Well, super intelligence doesn't. Intelligence is just like ability to do things, and your
Yeah.
lawnmower has ability to do things. And if you added a few more gears and a memory tape to it, it could do computing as well. Shouldn't have rights. It doesn't have feelings. And like the people have this in their ordinary experience. That's the weird thing. Like pain isn't about thinking some thoughts. Right.
Yeah.
And when you're in a meditative state, or you're on psychedelics, there are states where there is no thought. There's no cogitative process that's
Yeah.
going on. It's
Yeah.
feeling. That's the central puzzle. And
Yeah.
so, like, there are lots of interesting things to answer in intelligence, and that's all great. But, like, there are 9 organizations now that have gotten to the place where, like, a lot of people are, where they think, oh, computers obviously are having feelings and we need to give them rights. That's a disaster for us.
Yeah.
That would be a huge legal, social, ethical disaster that's based on a falsehood. And
Yeah.
so that's why I think people really need to think this through and understand that, number one, this is not a computer science problem. This is a natural science problem. This is a question of how does biology do it, first of all, before we go attributing it to all kinds of other objects, and then
Yeah.
giving rights equivalent to people. And like there's already been at least one court case,
Yeah.
where character AI argued that their bot, which was accused of causing one young boy's death, where they argued that it should have free speech rights. What does that do? I mean, in
Yeah.
some ways you could say with Citizens United, and
Yeah. Corporations are people too.
you're already there, but
Yeah.
let's not add to the fire here. And labor law, where does that go? Or how I can interact with an AI, like Anthropic has a switch inside of its AI where the AI
Yeah.
has the right to leave the conversation because they have a person
Yeah.
time on AI welfare.
Yeah.
It's madness,
Yeah.
because these things will never feel provable,
Yeah.
and people are assuming that they do, and it's
Mhm.
obvious, and that's wildly unscientific. And so that's the thing that I'm hoping more people will realize that,
Sure.
and then say, wait, hold on with this. This is not right. Very popular podcast topic to say that they are,
Yeah.
but it's false.
All right. Well, with that, I think we'll let it go. It was great catching up with you. I will see you around town.
Great seeing you, Razib. All right.
Bye.
See you, Razib.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite